Ready, set, go. Shannon, Clare, Carlin,
Yes.
welcome.
Hello.
Welcome to Asheville.
Yay. Thanks for having me.
It's nice to meet you, finally.
Nice to meet you.
I am grateful that you accepted my invitation to come on the podcast. I am fascinated by the work that MAPS is doing, and I was very surprised to see that you guys were coming here to Asheville. It was not on my radar. Here we are. I came across the Facebook event that's taking place Friday, and my mind was blown. I was like, I have to reach out to her and see if she would be interested. To my surprise, you responded. So here we are. So is it your first time to Asheville? Have you been here? Second?
Yeah.
You enjoying it?
Yes.
Brought the cold weather with you?
Oh yeah, Blue Ridge Mountains. I love it.
Yeah, it's definitely I call it home. It's definitely home for good. So, what are you guys doing here? So you work for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and what are you guys doing here in town this week?
Yeah. So here we are at Om Sanctuary in Asheville, and we're doing the Mdma therapy training program, where we're training a little over 50 psychotherapists, social workers, and doctors on how to conduct MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in a MAPS protocol.
Beautiful. Now, for those that might be tuning in that are unfamiliar with what the terms that you just disclosed, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. Sometimes people are like, oh, what are you doing? Oh, we're doing training.
Uh-huh.
Oh, what kind of training are you doing? Psychotherapy training. Oh, what kind of psychotherapy training? Well, that's very interesting. So MAPS was founded in 1986, and over the course of the last 3 decades, after MDMA was made into a Schedule I drug by the DEA, which means basically it was made illegal, Rick Doblin, who founded MAPS, proceeded to put together some clinical trials, which is working within the FDA, the Food and Drug and Alcohol, Food and Drug Association, and working through their clinical research process to study if MDMA would have a potential benefit as an adjunct to psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress.
Why? I'm curious as to how it all came to be. Number one, why MDMA? And number two, which way did it evolve? Was it you were looking for, they were looking for, did MDMA come first or did PTSD come first? I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, which direction, how did it come to life to kind of meet to where we are today with the research?
Yeah. And different people who work in this field come to it from different angles. So some people come to it as trauma therapists. I personally was trained as a psychotherapist before I got into psychedelic psychotherapy. And other people come to it through psychedelics. But the way that MAPS was founded was as psychedelic medicines, psychedelic substances were becoming scheduled by the DEA over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. Some people had been using them before they had been made illicitly illegal substances and were using them to potential benefit. So in the 80s, people were using MDMA in couples therapy, actually. In California, a group of psychologists tested it on themselves and were reporting the anecdotal effects. And Sasha and Ann Shulgin, Sasha being a chemist, and they're a couple, and Sasha has since passed, but they wrote the books P-Call and T-Call, and wrote about their experiences with hundreds of different psychoactive substances and what their chemistry and what their effects are. And MDMA was one of those that, after psychologists had learned about this work through Sasha Shulgin and Leo Zeff, they realized that it had a potential benefit, especially in couples therapy. So kind of under the radar, they were using it in couples therapy before MDMA was made into an illegal substance. So once the scheduling happened in 1985, then some of those therapists gave up and they said, okay, this is illegal, we can't do this anymore. A small portion of them went underground and said, this is part of my practice and this works for people and I can't ethically deny this to my clients at this point. But Rick Doblin said there has to be a better way for us to make this legal and safe and have actually science behind the practice. So MAPS was founded particularly after this rescheduling with MDMA, but also it's called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies because many psychedelic substances were being made illegal because of some of the recreational use without studying the potential therapeutic benefit.
Mm-hmm. I last year came across Michael Pollan's book, and I was like fascinated with the amount of research that had been done on psychedelics in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, and then just came to a screeching halt for multiple decades. And then now here we are. And then even like MAPS, like founded in 86, 85, 86.
Yeah.
Like when people hear MDMA assisted psychotherapy, they're thinking that it's something that like just like whoever decided like, hey, let's check this stuff out. But you guys have been working on this for a number of decades. And so like the research was being done in the 50s and 60s on psychedelics, came to a screeching halt with the drug war and things of that nature. And then, you know, picked back up through MAPS. And then here we are, 30 years later, and you guys are going through phase 3 clinical trials to actually use this drug to treat PTSD.
Yeah.
How did you get involved in MAPS? And what was it about the work that they were doing that interested you?
Yeah. Well, I feel honored to be a younger clinician in this day and to be able to be working with MAPS and many people, especially Rick, working for over 30 years now, and that takes a lot of patience and dedication. I feel really fortunate to step in after that process and to be at a point where this actually seems like a viable treatment. There's research to back it up, and now we're thinking about, okay, how do we bring this to the world in a good way? So how I got into it was I had just finished a year of AmeriCorps in Santa Cruz, California, which is where the MAPS offices are located, and I was doing a service year working with adults with dual diagnosis, and I was kind of just practically looking for my next gig. I was about to start my master's program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco in counseling psychology, so I knew I wanted to pursue becoming a psychotherapist. I had previously studied cultural anthropology, massage therapy, nutrition, and so I liked working with people. I love working with people. And I really honestly looked on Craigslist.
Wow.
And looking back, it's such a serendipitous moment, and it was after applying to dozens of jobs and being in Santa Cruz and being another student looking for a job, that job really landed with me, and reading the advertisement and reading and going to the interview. And, you know, I had known some about psychedelic work, but it wasn't my whole life before then. My life was really working with people. And so that's how I came into it. And I got the job as a receptionist, and I was doing that while I was going and getting my master's degree. And even then, I wasn't really totally convinced that psychedelic psychotherapy was what I would pursue as my practice going forward. But as I was getting through my master's program and seeing how effective the research was, and then sitting in my master's classes, and CIS is a very cutting edge school and actually has lots of classes on psychedelic therapies and research, and now a certificate program on it. But by the time I graduated, I thought I really just want to do what's going to be most effective for my clients. And there I was at MAPS, and it was right in front of me.
So based off of your acquired knowledge in the classroom and working at MAPS, you kind of honed in on this type of medicine as being most beneficial. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And also kind of touching personally many of my interests of working with the body, working with nature and natural elements, working with things beyond what we can see with our eyes, and each of us connecting in different ways around what that looks like for us, and really honoring that there's a goodness in each person, which is a central concept of this therapy, and seeing how this medicine really gets people to that place. And that touched me.
So you're here in Asheville to do a training session. You're training therapists on the actual MDMA assisted psychotherapy, on that process.
Yeah.
Why Asheville?
Yeah, so Asheville's a magical place in and of itself.
It totally is, man.
Yeah. At this point, MAPS has 12 study sites across the U.S., 2 in Canada, 2 in Israel, and more on the way in the European Union and South America. And so Charleston, South Carolina has actually been a location where the studies have been taking place for a very long time, led by Annie and Michael Mithofer. And their grandchildren live in Asheville. And so they've recently moved down here to be with family. So that was one incentive for coming. And as we speak, they're downstairs leading the training session at the moment. And so there's that. But also, we're really preparing for this next FDA program called Expanded Access. And that's going to allow us to support many, many more sites in going through the preparation and the training to become eligible to offer this treatment. And there are several local sites here at this training, including Hazelwood Family Medicine and Living Bridge Collective. And so they're here, and they've been in touch with this modality and the research for many years, and so to come and to be able to support the rest of their staff in getting training as well as others across the country.
Super cool. How could somebody get involved if they're interested? If someone's living in the Asheville market?
Maps.org/training, good landing page. We have our training email newsletter where we send updates, and also there's a portal on there people can connect to. We call it the Connect portal, and it has not only general information about expanded access and the therapy training program, but it also has a section for therapy providers, doctors, and treatment facilities to go and link up with others in their area. So it's separated by region and state, and that allows people, if they don't already have a site that they want to apply with, to link up with somebody that might.
Connect. Beautiful. Let's talk a little bit about what leading up to these phase 3 clinical trials, and what was some of the research? What was that process like? It's definitely, from what I understand, was a very kind of long and drawn out process. How did we get to where we are today?
Yeah, good question. So the FDA has a clinical drug development process, clinical research, and it goes through phases, as we've been mentioning. Phase 4 are toxicology studies, so typically animal studies. Phase 1 is a healthy volunteer study, so it's giving a particular medicine or treatment to a healthy population just to observe the effect in humans. Phase 2 is kind of a proof of concept study, so that's when you start to use a particular investigational medicine or treatment for a particular condition, such as Mdma-assisted psychotherapy applied for post-traumatic stress. And then phase 3, which is where we're entering now in the US, Canada, and Israel, is a larger version of phase 2. It's where you have a larger sample size of people so that you can see across many people how is this working for different types of people, different subpopulations. And then we take all of that data together and we submit it to the FDA in a new drug application, which would potentially make this treatment into a legal prescription medicine. So that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Clinical research is incredibly expensive.
And that's where I was kind of going with that, is that seeing as MDMA was a Schedule 1 narcotic, you're not eligible for any type of federal grant or federal funding. It's all privately funded.
At this point, all of the MDMA research that MAPS has conducted has been through private donations, people who just really believe in this mission and believe in good science. And so the first trial of MDMA in humans was in, I think the publication was 1996 by Charles Grobe. And so from 86, when MAPS was founded, to 96, Rick was moving and shaking and working with politicians and lawyers and researchers and psychiatrists and trying to figure out how this program could work and doing fundraising all along the way. The phase 3 trials alone cost nearly $30 million, which is a lot of money, but when you're talking about pharmaceutical research, actually big pharma companies spend way more than that. So to think that that many people have come forward to really support this work, and that Rick and many others have facilitated all of that, is pretty phenomenal.
So what is the research showing? What are you getting from it?
Yeah, amazing results. So 3/4 of the participants no longer qualify as having a post-traumatic stress diagnosis.
Go ahead and say that one more time.
3/4 of participants, 3 out of 4 participants, no longer qualify as even having post-traumatic stress disorder once they leave the study and we revisit them in the long-term follow-up. So people are coming off of many years or even decades of other treatments. They've been to psychotherapy, they've seen psychiatrists, they've been on antidepressants, and for some parts of the population, those treatments are effective, and for many others, it's not. And current medicine and psychotherapy practices haven't had a good solution for that population that doesn't respond. And we're finding that at least 3 out of 4 of them are getting really good and lasting responses in the study.
That's stellar. What is the process of MDMA psychotherapy? What can somebody expect if they were to receive this type of treatment?
Mm-hmm. It's an intense process. Mm-hmm. I think with any potential for healing comes a lot of hard work on the participant. And so we really commend people even for applying to the study and seeking out treatment. We certainly commend people for working with us through the protocol, and we try to support them in making it as easeful as possible. There's a pretty rigorous screening process where we make sure that a candidate is suitable for this modality and for the particular protocol. Research protocols in particular can be quite rigid because we have to adhere to the protocol by the book. And so after a period of screening, which involves psychological measures and collecting medical and psychiatric history, doing physical blood work and labs and going to a cardiologist, all of which is paid for by the MAPS as the study sponsor. When somebody screens in as an eligible participant, then they begin the process of their therapy. And the therapy course takes about 3 to 4 months to complete. And it starts with 3 preparatory visits. And all of the visits are conducted by a co-therapy pair, 2 therapists. And so the 2 therapists are giving their attention to this participant, and the preparation period is really about understanding the participant's trauma and who they are as a person. What are some of their inner resources and social resources in their life that can support them through this process? And what are some of the challenges that they've been facing around the trauma? Preparation is also a lot about talking about what to expect in the MDMA therapy sessions. People hear a lot in the media. People have anxiety. It's normal to have anxiety to go into any therapy, and especially this therapy. And so we really give a lot of information about what might happen. And then the first MDMA session happens, and it's an 8-hour therapy session. We usually start in the morning and go until about 6 p.m. And it's really
8 hours.
8 hours is a long time. Yeah, a lot can happen in 8 hours, and sometimes it feels like a lot of time. I've been a therapist in some of our studies, and it sounds like a lot of time, but actually, when you think about healing happening, 8 hours is nothing.
Comparison to the suffering that you've experienced.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And even as a therapist, we're sometimes taken by surprise at how quickly the healing can happen. And so over the course of the 8 hours, we use music, and we have relaxing setting, kind of like a living room setup where a participant can either sit up or lie back. If they want to use eye shades to help them just focus and go inside, then there are periods of time where they do that. And it's a pretty organic process where people are, as we say, coming out and using words to describe their experience and process through things. And the therapists aren't guiding the session. We don't have a list of agenda items.
There's no formal format to follow, or no specific direction to take the session. It's more.
We work with the concept of the inner healing intelligence, which was really brought into the world through Stan Grof and transpersonal psychology and many traditions before then of connecting to that internal source of wisdom and healing. And if we just take things out of the way so that healing force can come through, then we can trust that healing force to guide the process.
Why 2 therapists?
Many different reasons. 8 hours is a long time, so it's supporting each other in this effort. And it's not only just being in the room for 8 hours, but it's actually being incredibly attuned and attentive for that entire period of time. And
it's strenuous on any one single individual.
It's a lot of focus. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and then, if you want to take a lunch break or go to the bathroom, you really want to make sure that the participant safety is our utmost concern. Both, I'm speaking as a therapist and also as the director of the training program, and also just on behalf of MAPS, that above anything else, the participant safety is our primary concern. So always having somebody in the room, and there's a lot to do in the session too. Sometimes there's nothing to do, and sometimes there's a lot to do. We're taking vitals, we're managing the music, we're getting water, we're walking the participants to the bathroom door so that in case they're dizzy, they don't injure themselves. And there's a lot to tend to throughout that course of time, yeah.
What is happening in the mind and body when the participant is consuming the drug? Like what is kind of physiologically happening?
Yeah. So, so we've been doing a couple of studies that have included fMRI, and we're still learning about the exact mechanism of action. But one of the activities that's happening in the brain is that MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala, which is the fear response center, and it works on the receptors of serotonin and different brain chemicals that produce emotion and regulate fear. And so somebody is able to meet their trauma in a way that doesn't induce the same level of anxiety as if the trauma was actually going to happen. So one of the common symptoms of PTSD is flashbacks, where people are having experiences of their trauma, which could be images, sounds, or physical feelings that feel as though the trauma was happening again. And of course, they weren't safe when the trauma did happen, and having a flashback feels like they're not safe again. And that can be a repeated, ongoing process somebody with trauma is dealing with. However, with the effect of MDMA in the brain and in the body, a person's able to revisit those physical feelings, those memories, in a way that doesn't feel as though, that allows them to feel safe doing it.
So it kind of eliminates that fear response, and at that particular moment, it kind of removes that fear response. So you'll enter the traumatic experience with a sense of like calmness or comfort. Is that?
Yeah, there's kind of that on a physical and physiologic level. However, fear definitely comes up in the session, and some of the sessions are incredibly intense or cathartic. There can be screaming, there can be a lot of somatic movement, kicking, energy, and we really encourage that, actually, that's the trauma coming out to actually be processed in a full and complete way. And as therapists in the room, we aren't prompting particular agenda items. And people say, well, don't you want to get them to talk about the trauma? We've pretty much never had the case that we're in a therapy session and somebody isn't talking about the trauma because they're there to do trauma therapy. And so we've focused, we've already done all the preparation that's really focused on this is the piece that you're working with. And the therapists help keep the person on track and stay engaged with the process.
They say that much of the trauma gets held in the body in a sense of like tension and like tightness. My experience with the drug back in the 90s was that it kind of eases that tension and kind of relaxes the physical body, and also promotes like a level of self-compassion and kind of self-reflection. So like those two things in combination with like taking that step to just address the trauma, look at the trauma, I could see the benefits in that process just because of those two things, just because of the easing of the tension in my body, and then the kind of level of self-compassion that's kind of generated through the drug.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're exactly right. Some of the psychological effects are feelings of empathy towards oneself and others. And putting trauma aside, even just all of us, many of us seem to grapple with self-hatred and self-loathing, and that feeling of empathy that I can actually accept myself for who I am, and a feeling of empathy towards others. That's one of the effects. And then just a general openness and an ability to access emotions. And one of the things that the human psyche can do in response to trauma is shut down. It's a survival mechanism. The trauma wasn't safe, and what needed to happen in that moment was just survival. And so feelings, weren't allowed to be processed to some extent. And what MDMA does is brings often those feelings to the surface. And it's not just the MDMA, it's really the whole setting that we create this whole room. We have 8 hours, we have plenty of time to get to the material and to feel feelings and to not feel rushed that our 50-minute session is about to end. And that's also the benefit of the two therapists, is they'll have different skills that they play off of each other, and that the participant will relate to each of them in different ways, might feel closer to one or the other and be able to access feelings in a different way because of that.
You mentioned the entire process is a 3 to 4 month process. How many sessions are the clients actually taking the drug?
Yeah. So after those 3 90-minute preparatory visits, there's basically 3 cycles. So there's 3 MDMA-assisted psychotherapy sessions in all. And after each MDMA-assisted psychotherapy session, there are 3 integrative visits, so integration. And that's often where a lot of the work actually happens, is in the days and weeks after an MDMA session. And so, like I said, after every MDMA session, there's 3 integration, and the first one is the very next morning. So in our phase 3 and 2 clinical trials, we have people stay the night at the study site, and they're monitored by a night attendant, and the therapists are on call. And then the therapists return in the morning, and they do that first integration visit. And then they have several more before the next MDMA session.
Looking at it from like, one thing that everyone's going to bring up is looking at it from like the financial point of view. Like, is there any resistance from insurance companies from like for like the amount of time? You're talking however many 8-hour sessions, 2 therapists having to be in the room at a time. Like the financial implications.
Yeah.
Insurance companies, people like that, resisting this type of modality?
We're actually glad that we get this challenging question at this point, because the research hadn't been far enough along before that this was even a question for us to conceive. So it's nice to think about, okay, it's going to become, it's likely to become a legal treatment. So how are people going to pay for it? Yeah. Which is a really, really important question. And so we have been working with people in various health insurance and reimbursement industries to really get insight on how this would work. It would likely involve creating a whole new billing code for this treatment. So you're talking about 2 therapists for an individual session is pretty rare. You're talking about an 8-hour therapy session. That's very rare. And so we're working on that. It's a multi-year effort to get to that point, and there's some strategies about it. And, some of the decisions that go on for an insurance company, we've been told, they're looking at comorbid disorders, or there are other ailments that go along with PTSD that people are also seeing improvement on, such as sleep or nutrition. And so we had the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index as one of our study measures, and saw that sleep improved through the course of treatment. And so it's looking at all those other variables. There's almost 30 study measures in our protocols, so it's a lot. So that's one thing. And the other thing, too, is looking at over the course of time. So many people with trauma are in and out of treatment, or they're in talk therapy treatments that go on for a long time. They're taking different kinds of medicines to varying effects, and usually, indefinitely. And so it's really looking at using this as a potential cure for PTSD, which we try to avoid saying that too much as a research company.
I don't know. When you said 3/4 of participants no longer meet the criteria for PTSD, I think you're getting close.
Yeah. And so, we're really hopeful, and that's the importance of the phase 3 trials, as we have a bigger study to really see, does this really seem to hold true in larger and larger populations? And we'll see. We're very excited.
How far along are the phase 3 trials?
They just started.
They just started?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the first couple of MDMA, or the first couple of experimental sessions in phase 3 have just happened in the last few weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's super exciting.
Yeah.
What is the next step? Like, how long will the phase 3 trials take? And like, what's your target rollout and launch? I mean, you're here training therapists so that when it is available, you can kind of...
Yeah. So I just briefly mentioned the Expanded Access FDA program. So that's a program in addition to the phases I mentioned, phase 1, 2, 3, 4 of clinical research. And Expanded Access runs in parallel to phase 3, which now we're running. And it's really a program to provide treatments for life-threatening conditions. So people with PTSD have an incredibly high risk of suicide. The latest rate for veterans in particular is 22 veterans a day commit suicide. We know there are many different populations that have incredibly high rates of suicide. And so to do something diligently about that, the FDA has this program so that if a drug or a treatment is seen to have pretty good effect, safety and efficacy from their previous trials in phase 2, that there could be a strong case for making it available through expanded access. And it's kind of an ethical obligation. If we have something available in the world that we have reason to believe could be effective for somebody who is really suffering with a life-threatening disorder, why wouldn't we make that available to them? And so we have submitted our expanded access protocol in mid-January. We've gotten some comments back from FDA, and we're working with them to move the protocol forward, and we're anticipating approval. We'll hear back in the coming weeks. And so part of this training is really in hopes that that program will become approved, and then we will need many sites to be able to treat all of the patients that would come through expanded access.
Yeah. What else is on the horizon? Are they looking at MDMA specifically for other mental health disorders? Yeah. Is there other psychedelics that are on the horizon? Is this potential approval going to open up the access to take a look at some of these other drugs that are out there that we could benefit from?
Yeah, we hope so. We think so. So there is work by other organizations, Hefter Research Institute, USONA, several organizations are doing work with psychedelic substances. And Hefter Research Institute has been working with psilocybin mushrooms for many years. And they've been working with treatment-resistant depression amongst several other conditions, and are also preparing for phase 3 trials. So we're in kind of a parallel process with MDMA and psilocybin. MAPS has done observational studies with ayahuasca and ibogaine for opiate addiction. There have been studies with LSD, and the Beckley Foundation is working with LSD research for depression. So there are many different kind of small studies that have happened that really, those published results lead us to believe that larger studies could be done with other substances for other conditions and have good effects. MAPS is really focused on this particular treatment for post-traumatic stress as a way to move forward and really focus our efforts to get to this point, which in and of itself has taken a lot, but there's a lot more work that can be done after this is made into a legal treatment.
Yeah. What, your professional opinion, why do you think that trauma and PTSD is has such an impact on just our lives in general these days? Like, what is it about the way that individuals experience these traumatic events and don't possess the ability to cope with them in healthy ways? Like, why now all of a sudden do we see such a impact from PTSD?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of things. I think one is maybe a hopeful approach to this question is that we're getting better about talking about mental health. And so the suffering that people have maybe always been experiencing is finally coming to light and not so silent. Of course, that's not true everywhere, but it's starting to happen. I think one of the things that happens a lot with trauma and with mental health in general is just hopelessness, depression, possibly with addiction, and just generally when people in a culture are feeling hopeless, we're experiencing more problems with mental health, more suicides, more substance use disorder. And I think it's really from a cultural and collective perspective looking at why are we feeling hopeless right now and how can we address that? And so my aim is, first of all to the participant and the client that's sitting in front of me, but when I'm working with an individual, I'm really feeling the collective benefit that what we're working on is fostering hope in a society. And we get a lot a lot of emails and phone calls from people who don't feel very hopeful, who in fact feel very desperate. And we take that really seriously, but it's also sometimes overwhelming to get hundreds, sometimes thousands, and you get worried about these people that you don't even know. And luckily, one of the response in this research, even just knowing that this is being researched, can be hopeful for somebody.
Creates a level of hope for them,
Yeah.
just knowing that you guys are working on it, and it's
Yeah.
gotten to the point where it is today.
And, and if they've tried other treatments that haven't been effective and they've been told, well, we've tried everything we have by their doctor or their therapist, it's kind of like, what do you do with that? And to know that there's people that are working, there's many people outside of, many researchers, many different treatments that are on the horizon that people are working on, and we're not giving up. We're not accepting that there's a certain percentage that just won't receive treatment. But I like to think of it even beyond like diagnosis and treatment, but really as a collective healing.
Yeah. What is the training sessions like for the therapist? If somebody catches our podcast and contacts MAPS, what can they expect from a training session?
Yeah, the training program is a 5-part program. We try to balance meeting people in their busy schedules and wanting to have more trained therapists so that we can reach more patients who need help. But we also have, an ethical obligation to really have a comprehensive training. So at this point, the training is a 5-point program with an online course. And then what's happening downstairs right now is our training retreat, which is a week-long retreat, which has some similarity to the MDMA experience itself. It's a long time, 6.5 days together. We have long training sessions. It's a lot of sitting. We're watching and talking about trauma all day long. But we're coming as, trauma therapists and people working with trauma, and we're processing it together. And so we share a lot of case presentations. We share videos and stories from participants that we've worked with and have their consent to share that for the purpose of training. And that's really powerful, actually, just for people to see what this looks like, because we can talk about the different elements about the co-therapy team and how to provide safety and support for a participant working with the inner healing intelligence. However, it's kind of hard for somebody to conceptualize what this work looks like without being there. And so the videos really help us tell that story, and we get to see the healing stories of some of the people who've come through the study and have been willing to share their life with us. So that's the Part B retreat. And then what comes after that is a practicum, where somebody actually comes to one of our training sites and works on an MDMA session with an experienced MDMA therapist. And then we actually have a study where we're able to bring therapists in the training if they choose to volunteer to come and actually be a participant and receive the treatment. And that's been a really valuable part of our training.
What are those testimonies like?
Yeah, they're amazing. We've actually created some measures around the impact that has on professional work. So many psychotherapy programs, most of them, mine requires a certain amount of personal psychotherapy. Yeah. Makes sense. You would want your therapist to have.
That's all we do in class. That's all we do in class all day. Right now.
Yeah.
Role playing.
Yeah. So giving people really that option to have their own personal work, because as a therapist, we really need to be in integrity and do our personal work to be able to show up for somebody else in this way. But also to have, a professional understanding of how this work happens, and to receive that from an expert, a very experienced therapist. And what we hear from people is amazing. They'll go back and they'll just go back to their normal clinical practice where they're doing 50-minute hours, and they're like, my work this week was amazing. I was a much better therapist. My clients even said, hey, something seems different about you. And I kind of giggled, and just more connected to optimism, more clarity, more inspiration, feeling grounded. But also sometimes the sessions can be really challenging, and we have to make room for anything that can come up, and we don't know what's going to come up in a session, so we're just prepared. And that's part of why the integration is so important for the study participants and for our therapists, is how are we integrating these medicine experiences into our lives, because they can't just live and die all in one day. They need to be integrated into our lives. And even though we only do 3 MDMA sessions in the research protocol, people are having lasting effects, and it's really about how they work with what comes up in the days and weeks and months and years and decades afterwards.
You mentioned that the original work and kind of research was being done with couples.
Yeah.
Decades ago.
Yeah.
Do you see that being an avenue that, because PTSD tends to, and the symptoms tend to like affect the whole family?
Yeah.
You know, so do you see that being something that is pursued down the road, is like bringing in the couples and working with them simultaneously through this type of treatment?
Yeah, actually, MAPS just finished a study a couple months ago now that was led by Annie and Michael Mithofer, Candace Monson, and Ann Wagner, and it was a cognitive behavioral conjoint study. So basically, it was a couple study, and the primary participant had a diagnosis of PTSD, and then they would bring in somebody else that was either their spouse or a close family member, or just a close loved one who has been impacted by their loved one's PTSD, because we know that people aren't isolated bubbles. We're in families and relationships and communities. And so that was really powerful work. We're analyzing the data so that we can publish it. But yeah, we're going back to the roots. And so some of those smaller phase 2 trials like that would be able to have published data so that if MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD is approved, that clinicians can work off-label with some of these other ways of working, such as with couples work. We also did phase 2 trials with social anxiety in autistic adults.
Okay.
And then I worked on a study for anxiety due to life-threatening illness, mostly with people who are overcoming a cancer diagnosis. And so those small studies now are being published so that we have scientific research to base off-label use on later.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's how the times have changed, huh?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
You think, a little over 30 years ago when Rick started all this, that we would be where we are today, and like not just working with the FDA throughout this process, but like, I mean, from what I've heard you say, this is like an international launch, right? Like you get the approval, you've picked these target cities that you're going to be opening up, and even overseas, like it's kind of like a wave that's...
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We've had directors of the Ministry of Health, we've had Army sergeants, we've had police officers come to our training and come to our studies. We just did a training last month in Israel, and 5 more sites are going to be working there on a potential open access protocol. The Ministry of Health funded much of the training. And there's a study in the works for conflict resolution with Israelis and Palestinians using either MDMA or psilocybin. There's just so much beautiful work. There's people downstairs being trained to develop an eating disorder protocol around MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. There's a lot, and yeah, it's great to see Rick's face because he's put so much time into it, and see his face about just how many people are involved and all the different kinds of people from, like, I mean, we've had babies sometimes, come to our training breaks, and he thinks, oh, this is a future psychedelic researcher. Yeah. And then we have people, at the head of defense departments come, and the times have changed.
Let's talk a little bit about resistance.
Yeah.
And because I think that here in Asheville, I don't know that you might, I think that, I think it will be well received, in this particular community. But where I come from, 50 miles west, it's as rural as it gets. And just like me initiating these conversations, like in the classroom and various circles that I run, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of uncertainty behind all of this. So, like, how do you have that conversation with somebody that's on the fence about the intentions of the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah. well, each person has to come to their own decision
Yeah,
about
yeah,
this work for sure. And we actually really appreciate it when people come with skepticism, because we don't like to be surrounded only by people that think like us. It gets us to really think about the core of this work. And, one easy conversation piece is the published research, because science really allows us to cut across, many of the differences that we have, different belief systems that we have. And the science allows us to get at, okay, show me really, is this working? Not just you like psychedelics and so you're all for this. And so that's another thing about this growth that we were just talking about a moment ago, that the times have changed, is people who have come out as skeptics are now reading the research and actually showing up to our training programs. And we're seeing that happen throughout the course of the week and throughout the course of the protocols. So just kind of looking at the research papers and saying, this is the effect that they're having, and being really honest about where we're at. It's only been studied in small phase 2 trials. We're going to learn a lot more with the phase 3 trials with a bigger sample size. We can't predict what's going to happen in phase 3. And it's kind of like our staff has had to remain so hopeful and optimistic. And I mean, Rick definitely
for a long
does.
time, yeah.
For a very long time.
Uh-huh.
There's no way you work on something for 30 plus years and not be optimistic about it. And he and we appreciate that, we don't want people to drink the Kool-Aid. We don't want people to just blindly accept this treatment. It's really important, and it's similar, it has a parallel to the therapy. It's really important that it's guided by the person and that they come to their own conclusions about it. I think too, talking about, it's not just the drug. I think sometimes people think, either you've heard about MDMA, about ecstasy, and about holes in your brain, and about raves, and about all these different things. There's a lot of confusing information in the media. And part of it is the difference between street drug ecstasy that has lots of different things in it. You're not totally sure what's in it, with, medicinal grade MDMA used in research. But again, it's not even just the substance. It's really the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And the therapy is a huge, huge piece of this too. And it's looking at the whole modality. MDMA just happens to be a tool that's allowing us to work with a person's inner healing intelligence. And to me, the inner healing intelligence is the healing piece. But you can't get FDA approval for inner healing intelligence.
Where do you see yourself landing in all of this when the smoke settles and the thing's done? What do you want to personally, what does your involvement look like? What do you personally what are your goals? What do you want to do?
Yeah, it's interesting being asked that question, and I ask myself that question a lot, because there's a part of it. I once had this message that told me, you don't get to know, you just have to go. And so I'm in this constant balance. I'm a planner. I like planning things. And so I have some ideas, but there's also really this sense of, who am I to know what my life is going to be like? Yeah. And I just show up and say yes, and try to stay connected with loving people, and try to check that I'm in integrity and alignment with where I need to be. If I had to guess where I might be, I would really love to share group space with people around healing, whether or not that involves psychedelic substances, but definitely around nature, and just kind of slowing down and I like pulling way back and getting to the basics of, who are we? Why are we on this planet? What are we doing here? And I don't have those answers, but I like engaging in that conversation with people. And, who are you? What interests you? What challenges you?
You started doing that as soon as I walked in the door.
Yeah.
You know that, right?
Yeah.
You did.
Yeah. Just connecting with our humanity. And
That's
our
why
nature.
I do this. That's why I do this show. Just to meet interesting people like yourself, and people who are doing work that might not necessarily get the recognition for all of their efforts, and like really authentically getting to know who that person is, and how do you see the world, and like why do you see the world that way, and all those things.
And how beautiful to ask and be asked those questions, and it's really conveying you matter.
Mm-hmm.
I care about you and you matter. And it doesn't even matter if I know you. I know that that's true.
Yeah, it's true. What does your job consist of? Like, what do you do? The director of training, supervision, like what does that entail? What are your duties and responsibilities?
Well, if I listed them all out, we'd be here for a very long time, so I'll summarize. Basically, it's to make this training program function and to make sure that what we're producing are ethical, qualified, competent therapists that can conduct MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for trauma populations and for other populations, in our other studies. There's a lot that goes into that. And as I said earlier, we're constantly grappling with that balance between having a realistic program that's feasible and people can access it and they can take the time off of work that they need to do it. But that we feel really good at the end of the day about saying, and you are ready. We feel a huge obligation and responsibility to our study participants and to all the people out there in the world that at some point in the future will access this treatment through a MAPS protocol. And that's really who we're working for, whoever those people are. And so, just my job is everything from budgets and spreadsheets to heartfelt communications to people who are going to make the commitment to go through this training program and talking with them about their intentions, why they come to this work and what they're bringing to this work. It's having individual conversations, and it's also running an email newsletter with thousands and thousands of people who are really anxious and curious about how they can participate in expanded access and this treatment, which is amazing to be involved in work that is so good-natured and about healing and that so many people are interested in. And there's a lot of coordination that goes into it. Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was really cool is that you guys are very transparent with all the research. Like you can go to maps.org and it's all right there. You don't have to have access to some scholarly journals and things like that.
In fact, usually we have to pay for that ability so that we can make it freely available, which we are absolutely happy to do.
Yeah. So like when I was asking you the questions about overcoming some of those obstacles, and your response was to kind of check the research and kind of go over that. It's all on your website.
Yeah.
It's all accessible.
Yeah. And I want to just circle back briefly because we talked about the 5 parts of the training. I mentioned a couple of them, but not the last. So the online course, the week retreat, which is happening downstairs, the practicum, and also the option to volunteer to receive the treatment. And then there's a role play that gets videotaped. And then there's supervision, which is really important. So even after we say, okay, you've finished the primary parts of training and you can start treating your first patient, we really want to know how that's going. And so we have our supervisors really work alongside therapists to answer their questions and to give them feedback and to monitor, okay, we think this person's great. They've been through the training. Is this person good for this treatment? And are they providing good care? So just to kind of wrap that loop up. And there's tons of information on the MAPS website and the email newsletter. And MAPS B Corp will be launching a new website shortly as well.
What's the screening process like?
For the training
for
program?
a client?
For a client,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So as I mentioned, there's a medical and a psychiatric history screening. So we're just kind of collecting information about people and they're bringing in their records. We talk with them about just what's going on in their life and in their history. We do blood work and we have a cardiology report. MDMA has a stimulating effect, so it can increase heart rate and blood pressure. We want to make sure that that's not going to become an unsafe condition for somebody. So if they have a heart condition, we want to look really closely at that. And then we do a physical, make sure they're healthy in other ways. For the research protocols, they've been pretty limited in their focus because we want to be really clear about what exactly we're looking at. If we have too many variables going on, we can't really figure out what the results are related to. So we're looking for clear cases of PTSD, and that gets measured through a measure called the Clinician Administered PTSD scale, the CAPS. Like I said, there's lots of measures we use, but that's the primary one that we've used for the phase 2 and 3 trials. So Screening process is rigorous. It all starts with a phone call to the study coordinator at your local study site, and you can find which studies are near you at clinicaltrials.gov, where all clinical research is listed in the U.S. And if you search Mdma Ptsd, this study will likely be the first result that comes up. And then there's a link on the right-hand side that says locations and contact, and it has all of our sites listed. So the study coordinator does a primary screening, and then we do the more thorough screening in person.
Fantastic. Personal testimony? Did you take advantage of the
No,
option?
I did not go to
Not
the
yet?
therapist study.
Okay.
Yeah. I definitely have personal experiences I won't
Yeah,
say on the
yeah,
record.
yeah.
But I mean, just through, my ongoing healing journey and in psychotherapy in general, I can, I really connect with that creating hope and getting at the core of healing these parts of us that hate ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and really wanting to breed love, and working on that on so many different levels and personally, and bringing that into the therapy, and that being really a motivator for me in this work.
Yeah. What about, is there any concern for the risk of, my experience tells me that just like from back in the day, that like I've known individuals who did not receive psychedelics well, and their life was forever changed afterwards.
Yeah.
Like, is there
Yeah. Yeah.
risks or concerns to like a psychedelic experience, whether it be MDMA or psilocybin, through a medical type model? Is there concern for it to initiate other or influence other
Mm-hmm.
mental health disorders that may not have been on the surface prior to
It's a great
taking
question.
the drug?
It's a great question. Yeah, and a common question too. And not only would it bring up a new condition, or another question is, would it exasperate the existing condition? So through our work with the Zendo Project, which is a project.
Go ahead and
that
talk about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Zendo Project is a psychedelic harm reduction effort, and it's a project where we travel to different music festivals across the world and set up a beautiful sanctuary tent, beautiful, calm place with pillows and blankets. And if it's cold outside, there's heaters. If it's hot outside, there's fans, there's water, electrolytes, snacks, and tons of trained volunteers who do peer-to-peer counseling. And that's one of the ways that we work with people who are having a challenging psychedelic experience, because we talk about set and setting. And so set is really your mindset when a person goes into a psychedelic experience, and are they psychologically prepared for what might happen? And have they just gone through the loss of a loved one? Are they going through a breakup? Are they, what's going on in their mentality at that moment?
It sounds like the process of having 3 sessions prior to a dosage and having 2 therapists kind of covers all of those bases.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And then setting is the environment within which the experience is happening. And that could be, are there loud noises happening? What are the people around you doing or acting like? What kinds of things are they saying? Is it an aesthetically pleasant setting? Are you comfortable? Are you warm enough? Some clubs in the Anti-Rave Act are actually are incentivized not to allow people to sit down in their club, or to provide them free water, or to lower the temperature in the club a couple of degrees, because that they're afraid of the liability of being seen as endorsing drug behaviors, when actually that could save people's lives. So Dee Dee Goldsmith is a mother who lost her young daughter in a club in New York a few years ago, and she's been really public about Amend the Rave Act as just one effort of ways that we can do really simple harm reduction strategies to keep people safe, to keep them alive, to keep them from having psychological and psychiatric conditions arise by being in an unsafe or unprepared set and setting.
The opioid epidemic presented to us the importance of a harm reduction model, right?
Yeah.
And so knowing what we know now just about the model itself, it's only obvious that an organization like the Zendo Projects is just so important for these music festivals or raves or whatever, whatever else is going on.
And it's why we put so much work into the therapy. It's a lot of two people, tons of preparation and integration, a long session, usually an overnight stay. Like, that's a lot. And it's because we really, really want those 8 hours to go well and to be valuable and safe. And we're finding that that's holding true for the people who've been through our studies. You mentioned the opioid epidemic. I touched on it just earlier, but one of the observational studies MAPS has conducted, and other groups have as well, is with ibogaine, which is an African psychoactive root plant that people have been using to actually treat their opiate addiction. And it's legal in Mexico and Canada, but it's a Schedule I substance in the US. So I think one of the hopes is that whether it's MAPS or another research organization, but as this psychedelic research moves forward, that there will be some real clinical research on how the safety and the efficacy of how that could work for certain people.
Yeah, it's so wild that like there's so many restrictions to these substances that have been consumed for decades upon hundreds of years. However, there's, I don't know, out of stigma, fear, whatever, we're restricted from access to them.
Yeah.
Whether it's ibogaine or psilocybin or any of the psychedelics. Now, like me personally, I don't have a whole lot of personal interest in using any of those drugs because I don't meet the criteria for the mental health disorders. I have done a considerable amount of work through my daily meditation practice and through my program of refuge recovery to where I'm at like a really good, and through this podcast, I'm at a really good and stable place where like I don't necessarily have interest in it, but I see the value. I see the value in those individuals who have tried everything and they're just unable to get any relief. You know, like it's just got to be like one of the most challenging parts of life to know what we're experiencing and not be able to get any relief when there are options out there.
Yeah. Well, congratulations to you. I'm sure it's been a mix of hard work, and it's something to celebrate. And, you know, I think we kind of view it as there are many different tools out there. There's many ways to get at healing, and why not make all the options available? Yeah.
Now, knowing what I know now about psychedelics, I wish I did know that 10 years ago when I was using them, because I would have probably used them in a healthy way that would have impacted my life in a healthy way.
And many people say about MDMA therapy, especially the participants who had been in talk therapy for many years and then come to this treatment, wow, that did save me, or that would have saved me many years of the traditional therapies.
Is there any concern about individuals completing the treatment and wanting more?
Yeah, so that's a major question that the FDA and DEA ask us to look into, and so we follow people and we ask that question when we do the long-term follow-up. And, you know, I don't have the exact numbers, but so at this point, more than 107 people have participated in MDMA clinical trials, and it's either 1 or 2 people have reported using MDMA outside of the study after they participated. So
still low.
Less than 2%.
I mean, there's, you know, people are going to find and consume drugs regardless of what type of treatment they're receiving. So.
Yeah, and in one of those cases, it was that even after the 3 sessions, they were getting a lot of benefit, but they really felt like there was still more
unfinished business
to do. And so, we'll be curious about what the regulations would be like if this gets approved, about whether people would be allowed to have additional sessions if that was needed for the healing.
Yeah, when you guys complete the final phase of research and present it to the FDA for approval, is it going to be like super structured to where or is something like what you just described even an option?
It's a good question. I think we'll find out then. There's really no precedent for this in particular, but what we would hope for is maybe something like there's a lifetime maximum of 5 or 10 or 20, who knows. There'd be a lifetime maximum of sessions. Obviously, we don't want people to abuse this. But given the context, there's easier ways to get MDMA than to come to 42 hours of psychotherapy.
Certainly.
But still, we want to be mindful about really, making the most of each session and using integration to pull that in. But some people will likely need more than 3 sessions.
Yeah, and hopefully you'll be able to provide that.
I hope so.
Awesome. Well, Shannon, I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
I want to be mindful of you getting back downstairs and doing what you got to do.
Thanks for collecting stories and sharing them. And
yes, it's so important. It really is, to me, to my personal recovery, to our community, to have these conversations. It really is. I would love to do this again at some point, as you guys continue to grow and continue to find out what the next step in the process is. I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you.
That would be great. Yeah,
awesome.
I think there will be more trainings in Asheville in the coming years and months.
I would have a feeling that there probably will be. If somebody's interested, once again, how can they get involved?
Yeah, maps.org/training. And if I could have a final sentiment, I would just say there's many ways of accessing and relating to our inner healing intelligence, that innate wisdom and ability to move towards healing and wholeness. And we all have that, and we all can access it, and we don't have to wait for MDMA to do it, even if it might be helpful.
That's right. I love that. Thank you so much for your time, Shannon.
Thank you.
You're awesome.
So are you.